I wonder if our forebears in this church in the winter in the 19th century were constantly having their glasses fogged up. Can you see my breath? Florence Nightingale led quite a life. Yet when you hear a typical version of her story in a children's book or a brief bio, you don't hear half of what she accomplished or any of her failings. Her gender is undoubtedly partially responsible for her not getting full credit. A woman succeeding as a nurse, well, that's been long accepted. That part of the story is fine. And that she went on to organize, professionalize, and improve the practice of nursing, well, that fits too, at least with the 20th century version of the narrative. But when she went to the field hospital in the Crimean War, what are we told about what she did there? She carried a lamp, and she brought solace to the wounded soldiers, and she did the washing up. She cleaned. Yeah, the stories offer some tacit recognition that she was innovating and that she was running the operation. She directed other people to clean up the filthy mess of soiled beds, the nearby open cesspools, and the unwashed hands. Though even when that story is told, it's having her in charge of other nurses. What you might never have been told, what you might never have heard, is that bringing about a transformation in hospital practice to make what she did, other than a one-time improvement in one facility where she was, required her to basically invent the field of statistics-based medical record keeping. Before her, even counting was a rarity. How many soldiers or other people undergoing medical care were dying of what? She instituted counting, and she developed ways to turn counting into useful information. She did a lot more than washing up. After the war, she was the first woman ever to be chosen as a fellow of the Royal Statistical Society. It wasn't good enough to stumble onto a solution to the hygiene problems that were infecting and killing the wounded in droves. She needed to show that it was working. Being right is great, but being heard is usually a much greater challenge. And yes, stumble onto the solution is the right way to think of it. Germs had not yet been discovered. No one yet knew why filth caused infection and death, but she managed to do the right thing without knowing the right reason. So Nightingale started keeping records and invented this graphical representation of her results. Yeah. If you published a nightmare like this today, you'd probably be featured in the Graph Crimes Twitter feed. But at the time, this innovation made all the difference. Collecting data in the first place and then presenting it in a way that was, well, kind of readable. All you need to know is that the light blue wedges include the deaths from infection among the wounded, and that they shrunk markedly over time, particularly as a ratio to battlefield casualties. Chances are that Nightingale's contributions would have been a footnote to history without her inventing this graph. In that hypothetical world, it probably would have taken years or decades for her ideas to be accepted. Or perhaps even that footnote wouldn't appear. She was a woman in the 19th century, after all. History is a struggle. Sometimes you win. Usually you don't win until later. One thing that you probably didn't figure out looking at that weird graph is that it took 6 or 7 months before her innovations brought about a statistically definitive effect that no one could ignore. That's an observation that you won't find in the typical biography and that seldom even shows up in the scientific biographies. I had to do the calculations myself. And ever since I did those calculations, I've been thinking about how her experience then compares to our experience in our current epidemic. I mean, yeah, Nightingale got things done a lot faster than the 2-year fiasco we're in the midst of right now, but she had operational control in a single facility with military discipline, and she figured out what to do fairly rapidly, and yet fixing things still took a while. No record I've seen gives any indication as to why. Nightingale didn't write a tell-all book, perhaps to her credit. If we had a chance to ask for some passages from that non-existent book, from The Ghost of Florence, I suspect that the most popular question would be, was she indeed a lesbian, as widely believed? But I'd ask for some war stories about why it took quite so long to turn things around in that hospital. I find myself imagining her talking to the personnel at the hospital. No, you have to remove the cesspool that's close to the patient's bed. The barrier you built beside it won't help. The miasma is airborne. To explain, before the discovery of microbes, the prevailing belief was that miasma, roughly meaning bad-smelling air, was the vector that led from filth to infection. Nightingale, in my imagination, goes on, and no, it doesn't matter that it's more than 2 meters away. Or her telling her nurses, I don't care if you're bored of washing blankets and need an off-ramp, whatever that is. We need to keep doing it for as long as the wounded keep getting them dirty. And it must have been especially fun dealing with the men who are accustomed to running everything their way. No, doctor, washing your hands between patients for the last 5 days does not mean you can skip it today because your skin is irritated. You have to do it every time. No, you can't plan to ever stop doing it. It is now and will be for the rest of your career the right thing to do. And you know what? Before long, it will seem insane that there was ever a time that people didn't do it. I mean, what do you think this is? Some simplified history story where all the problems are solved in a self-contained epic stroke and everyone lives normally ever after? Huh. Yeah, they probably did think that. Because we all think that, or at least we feel that. When we learn about history, whatever the status is at the end of the story seems normal, because that's the way things are now, or at least it was a step toward the way things are now. In stories about transformative events, the situation at the start of the story is weird and wrong, and the events corrected it. When you're living history, though, transformative events are unsettling, to say the least. It's hard to have faith in change when every change in history stories feels inevitable, because changes in our lived history do not feel that way. We've all heard that history is written by the victors, but it's more than that. History is written about the victories. We have to remember that when you are living history, it's mostly not victories. History stories make the past seem like simple, efficient progress. Those stories gaze down on us in silent criticism of the torturous muddles that we live through as we travel around the coils of the slinky. The heroes in our abbreviated stories are also always better than the people that we know. But Nightingale was no saint. She was an outspoken supporter of British colonialism. She was openly racist, referring to colonized people as inferior and barbarians, and showed an open disdain for their deaths. She weaponized the miasma theory as a reason for disdaining the unclean, who she included colonized people, sex workers, and various others. That kid's book's seeming a little creepy now, huh? Even her accomplishments had a dark lining. Her rigid notions of what constituted proper regimented nursing behavior are still causing harm in populations where traditional ad hoc approaches are more appropriate for the circumstances. We hold our living heroes to standards that we only think our historical heroes met, because we only know the children's book versions of their stories. Nightingale also did not have unmitigated success in her life. Yeah, she transformed hospital hygiene and medical statistics, but she also got sick right after that at about age 40 and was plagued with what was probably ME, chronic fatigue syndrome, a condition that afflicts many people following viral infections, including COVID. Despite that, she continued to have an impact on the development of nursing. However, when she tried to endow a chair at Oxford with her own money, trying to create what would be the first academic position in what we would probably now call applied population statistics, they refused. When she petitioned the British government to start collecting the statistics that would make more analyses like hers possible, they balked at it. In fact, the last of her recommendations wasn't implemented until the 1980s. She would have had to live double her already long life to see all her ideas come into being. Life lived on the edge, by which I mean the edge of the slinky, rather than taking the shortcut past the gaps, is mostly not victories. It tries our faith to live in the middle of history, not yet knowing the conclusions. But remember, victories sometimes still happen. I want to thank everyone who helped make this service possible. Blessed be.
Anisnabi Elder Basil Johnson tells of the time our teacher, Nanabosho, was fishing in the lake for supper, as he often did, with hook and line. Heron came striding along through the reeds on his long, bent legs, his beak like a spear. Heron is a good fisherman and a sharing friend, so he told Nanabosho about a new way to fish that would make his life much easier. Heron cautioned him to be careful not to take too many fish, but Nanabosho was already thinking about a feast. He went out early the next day, and soon he caught a basket full of fish, so heavy he could barely carry it, and far more than he could eat. So he cleaned all the fish and set them out to dry on the racks outside his lodge. The next day, with his belly still full, he went back to the lake and again did what Heron showed him. Ah, he thought as he carried home the fish, I will have plenty to eat this winter. Day after day, he stuffed himself, and as the lake grew empty, his drying racks grew full. They sent out a delicious smell into the forest where a fox was licking his lips. Again, he went to the lake, so proud of himself. But that day, his nets came back empty, and Heron looked down on him as he flew over the lake with a critical eye. When Nanabosho got home to his lodge, he learned a key rule. Never take more than you need. The racks of fish were toppled in the dirt, and every bite was gone. This an excerpt from Breeding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. She writes, cautionary stories of the consequences of taking too much are ubiquitous in native cultures, but it's hard to recall a single one in English. Perhaps this helps to explain why we seem to be caught in a tragic trap of overconsumption, which is as destructive to ourselves as to those we consume. Collectively, the indigenous canon of principles and practices that govern the exchange of life that is known as the honorable harvest. They are rules of sorts that govern our taking shape our relationships with the natural world, and rein in our tendency to consume. That the world might be as rich for the seventh generation as it is for our own.
In this coming week, most of us will celebrate Thanksgiving, a holiday centered in gratitude. People across the country will gather around tables filled with food. Some will pause for a moment at the beginning of the meal for gratitude, for prayer perhaps, or for the naming of what we are thankful for. There are ways in which this holiday seems to be a pretty good example of the honorable harvest. It is, in fact, one of the few times a year for some of us that eating the fruits of the earth is accompanied with intentional gratitude. And yet, the supposed origins of this holiday were anything but honorable. The myth of the first Thanksgiving tells us that it was a peaceful, friendly meal between the early European settlers and the Native Americans who had helped them when they first came to this land. What we know now is that this story is full of gaps and even outright lies. Those European settlers were anything but kind to the Native Americans and claimed land that was not theirs to take. Though there may have been moments of peace and friendship, the overwhelming story of those early settlers was one of violence and theft, pushing out the indigenous people who had lived for years, pushing them out of their lands by force. In Plymouth, where the first Thanksgiving is said to have happened, Indigenous people have gathered since 1970 on this fourth Thursday in November, not for celebrations and feasting, but instead for fasting and a day of mourning. They gather to mourn the lives and legacies of those who have been lost due to European colonization of the Americas, for the lands that have been stolen, and for the indigenous cultures that have been ignored and sometimes forgotten. These early colonizers were not practicing the honorable harvest. Like Nabosho in the story, they took and took and took, thinking only of themselves. And in so many ways, we continue to take and take and take, pausing maybe once a year to offer gratitude, but not much more than that. In Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Wall Kimmerer tells us that the honorable harvest goes even deeper than gratitude. It is about consent, asking and abiding by that answer. It's about respect, using what you take with intention and honor. And it's about reciprocity. From you I receive, to you I give. About what we give back to the earth to ensure that it will be here for 7 generations in the future. There are all kinds of ways that we need to get back in balance through practices of the honorable harvest. As Robin Wall Kimmerer writes, we need the honorable harvest today, but like leeks and the marten, it is an endangered species that arose in another landscape, another time, from a legacy of traditional knowledge. That ethos of reciprocity was cleared away along with the forests, the beauty of justice traded away for more stuff. One of the ways that we are seeking to restore balance, to live into gratitude and reciprocity that the honorable harvest calls for, is by looking at our own history as a congregation and figuring out how to hold the good and the bad of it in it. how to learn from the errors of our ancestors, and how to make amends. We live and worship on stolen lands, marred by violence against people and against the land. One of the ways that we find hope for the future, for that seventh generation that comes after us, is by naming and acknowledging this history, by trying to bring back some balance to our earth, by honoring where we have come from. This is not easy work, and it is certainly not always comfortable, but it is vital to our survival and to the survival of our world. Our next anthem invokes that spirit, the spirit of hope, of all that we need to survive, and of that hard work of living into a better future.